Welcome to The Teacher's Story. I'm Jackie Scully. This is a podcast to elevate teacher voice. In this program, you will hear teachers sharing their journey into this profession and their ideas for education. I'm kicking it off Teacher Appreciation Week, which starts May 2nd. This is about honest, vulnerable, inspiring storytelling. It's a time and a space for teachers to share their ideas for the future of education. Teachers are beautiful beings who give their heart and soul to their community. They're innovators, they're inspirational, not only to children, but to the people around them. And they deserve to share their voice. So welcome to The Teacher's Story. Enjoy. Hi, welcome to The Teacher's Story. I'm Jackie Scully, and today we have Michael Strong. And I came across Michael Strong through a former guest on this show, Raheen Fatima, who is a young adult who took education into her own hands and found the Socratic Experience. And Michael Strong is the founder of that school. And today we're going to learn more about his background in education and how he was inspired to start this school. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, Jackie.
So my first question for you is, what inspired you to get into education?
So it's a long story. I'll try to tell it relatively quickly. When I was in high school, I had a class where the teacher we read and discussed books. So as a junior, we read Plato, Nietzsche, Buber, and we just talked about it. And I loved it. And for me, it was one of those experiences, some movies, it starts in black and white. At some point, it turns to color. It was that dramatic for me. I love thinking and talking about ideas. And so there's a college in the United States, St. John's College, campuses in Santa Fe and Annapolis, where all classes for 4 years are taught by means of Socratic dialogue. So 4 years of conversation, no lectures. I ended up having good test scores, so I went to Harvard, but I hate being lectured at. So I left Harvard to go to St. John's, and 4 years of that, I wanted to share this delight with intellectual dialogue. While I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago, I began going into inner city classrooms in Chicago through Mortimer Adler's Paideia Project and leading Socratic Seminars with kids. And it felt like I was liberating prisoners. They were so eager to talk, so eager to think. And that led to a career basically where initially in Alaska, I was hired to be a full-time Socratic teacher trainer going into public schools and training teachers to lead Socratic seminars. We were on soft money, grant money. And so after the grant money ran out, some parents loved what we were doing and asked me to start a private school based on Socratic dialogue. So I became an accidental education entrepreneur. From there, I joined a Montessori school in San Antonio, where they asked me to create a Socratic Montessori high school, and I Socratized the pre-K through grade 8. I then created a school for highly gifted children in South Florida that was based on Socratic and very advanced math and science. Then Montessori middle schools in the Palo Alto area based on Socratic and Montessori. Then a charter high school in Angel Fire, New Mexico, again based on Paideia Socratic. I then met John Mackey, the founder and CEO of Whole Foods, and he and I created a nonprofit promoting entrepreneurial solutions to world problems. But then I got back into education about a decade later, both Socratic and now more entrepreneurial and creative projects for students. That eventually became the high school model for the largest Montessori network in the US. And in 2020, when COVID hit, everyone else was talking about how terrible online education was. Turns out dialogue works pretty well online. And so I started the Socratic Experience with 3 students on my credit card in fall of 2020. Now we're about 160 students around the world, Pakistan, Taiwan, Eswatini, families from around the world, Iraq, Guatemala, Honduras, so all over the place. So it's been a delightful journey.
Wow, that is so impressive. And thank you for a pretty, quick synopsis of so much that you have done in your time. Before we get a little bit more into the School of the Socratic Experience, just for our listeners, I am well versed in the Socratic Seminar. We use it in our history department. I also agree that during the pandemic in virtual teaching, the Socratic Seminar method and just discussion-based types of lessons really worked well. I actually connected with my students. I teach upperclassmen, so I teach 11th and 12th grade, so it worked out pretty well to have these deeper conversations
over virtual. And I just felt like it was a time where we connected more because there wasn't a lot of other distractions, right, in like the classroom and social and all of that. But can you explain to our listeners about the Socratic method just a little bit?
Sure. So the basic format, and sometimes I use, because I actually like tracing it back to the historical Socrates,
Yeah.
but sometimes I simply use intellectual dialogue. Adults who care about ideas, we spontaneously talk about ideas. I always joke that on my first date with my wife, I was asking her questions throughout the date, and she said, "You're giving me a headache." And so it wasn't auspicious, but now we're happily married and we talk about ideas all the time. And so there's, some of us enjoy talking about ideas. In a lot of ways, that's what we want to introduce in the classroom, this delight in intellectuality that many adults have and many students don't yet have. So if the basic format at St. John's, and I've done a variation on that, is we read something together. Sometimes we read it in class, sometimes it's a painting, but there's a text, even if the text is, say, a painting or a photograph or whatever. And then the guide, we call them guides rather than teachers, simply asks questions, open-ended, thought-provoking questions. Sometimes I do it without a text. In our elementary program, I have asked young children, how do you know if you've been manipulated? And they have all kinds of opinions on that. Or when is it okay to cause emotional pain? All sorts of opinions on that. So we get them thinking and talking about ideas. It's helpful to have smaller numbers. Our classes are all 15 to 1. I've done it in public schools with 30 to 1. You have an inner circle and an outer circle, but you get much more intense energy if it's about 10 to 15 students. Actually, too small, it's hard to get the energy. But yeah, desks in a circle, some text in common to focus the conversation, ask a question, and then there are a variety of techniques for making sure the question flows and goes deeply. And I've written a book on this, The Habit of Thought from Socratic Seminars to Socratic Practice. So if any educators want to go deep with me, some cases it's easy. When I started training teachers to do this, sometimes I just walk into a class, ask a question, most incredible conversation done. Or sometimes it's really difficult. There's some groups of students where, boy, it's hard. And it really depends on classroom chemistry. I used to do 7 sections in a row. I'm the same person, use the same text. Third period was easy, 4th period was so hard. And so part of becoming an experienced Socratic discussion leader is expanding the range of groups with which if the practice is effective and developing a broader repertoire of techniques.
Yeah, and I find that you have a structure, and like you said, the teacher's the guide, and there is a flow, so there's a lesson, but it's meant to also be very organic too. And I was just having this conversation with a former colleague yesterday. We had this little reunion because she retired in the pandemic, so never saw her after 2020. And we talked about the best lessons are when you have those like organic conversations and you dive in deep and you kind of go off of, well, this is what I had planned, but there's an interest here and there's like this light, this spark. Let's go there because why not? Not everything has to be so structured. And also, you grade these conversations and there's rubrics with it, but sometimes it's just nice to have the conversation and have the discussion and not necessarily have the student ask, well, what am I going to get on this? Like, what are the point values for this type of question or this type of answer, so that we're moving more in a place of real discovery. So when you're an adult, you're having conversations and these discussions about the world and issues and whatever you're passionate about. And there isn't like, well, what am I getting for this, right? What's the intrinsic motivation with that? So kind of like off of that, and I don't know if this is something you incorporate at the Socratic Experience. Is there like a grade or rubric or something that's also tactile tied to this method, or is it purely just to encourage students to fully get into learning and asking questions for the sake of just learning about
So
topics?
lots of deep and interesting questions in there. You're getting right at, I would say, the crux of the issue. First, I would say just in public school, the whole standards movement, No Child Left Behind, and that orientation has made it more difficult to use Socratic seminars in public schools because it works best when one has a lot of freedom and flexibility. And the accountability movement has increasingly interpreted education. It's always been, the model has often been content transmission rather than intellectual discovery. But public schools have gone heavy into the content transmission piece. I would say there are a variety of ways to integrate the two, but I like to be a purist in the intellectual discovery. And going at a very basic thing, often when one is asking questions as a teacher in a classroom, one has a mental model of what the right answer is. And one asks the student, what do you think about X? But really it's, oh, yes, that's a good answer. Oh, no, that's a bad answer. And I compare it to, in poker, a tell. And I've been in students, academically ambitious students that want to know what the right answer is. And they're very annoyed with me as a leader, a Socratic leader, because I don't know what answer he wants. Precisely. For me, getting kids to think independently, authentically about what they believe and why is the whole game. And so I'm very scrupulous about there is no right answer. There is reason and evidence. We expect them to use reason and evidence to understand the text. But going back to classroom, although I do have a rubric in the back of my book for evaluating the quality of the discussion, it's a self-evaluation rubric for students, and I explicitly do not grade the students on the quality of the discussion, because my personal opinion is, well, we want them to understand the evaluation standards. I want them to self-evaluate and not have me evaluate. Conversely, in the conventional setting, I use written work entirely as the basis for grade. And I write a lot. I often say I love learning. I hate school. One of the reasons I hate school is I never understood the point of language arts classes. So I was a good student, straight A's, but it seemed like an arbitrary game. And part of what I realized is, as an adult writer, writing is about 95% thinking. And often I would just be presented with this random language arts assignment. What's the symbolism and blah, blah, blah. What? Okay, I'll make something up. Whereas when the students have an hour to think about something, then they're motivated to write. I'll give you a concrete example. We have, there are 2 essays from Yale on should we bring the woolly mammoths back from extinction or not? And we read both, pro and con. And the students care about that. Some students, yes, we should. It'd be so cool to bring the woolly mammoths back. Other students, no way, that'd be a horrible ecological disaster. Whatever they believe, they argue it. And at the end, okay, you've just outlined an essay. A lot of students hate essay writing, but basically, if you have a thesis you're defending, yeah, it's so cool to bring them back. And then reasons, because yay, A and B and C, you just outlined an essay. And so I see the key product coming from Socratic Seminars as essay writing. And then even taking this to say, AP, one of the schools I did was exceptionally successful on AP exams because, AP history courses, people focus on the 800-page content coverage, but you can actually score a 4 or 5 on an AP history exam strictly by getting the top score on the essays, even if you got all of the multiple choice wrong. Nobody realizes that, but it's harder. I think it's easier to cover content, and our mental model is content coverage, but getting students to become really great thinkers and writers and sophisticated. A lot of what I see is I want my students to be intellectually sophisticated. They understand the ins and outs of all sorts of arguments. Great writing, I think one of the challenges of teaching great writing, you can teach topic sentences and grammar and punctuation, you can teach all these things, but what's hard is to teach students to be intellectually sophisticated. Whereas hours and hours in Socratic discussion gives them, that facility with different kinds of arguments, how to respond, how to put one's, ideas, how to frame one's ideas vis-a-vis different audiences. So yeah, I'm very pure on in the discussion itself. No content coverage, but writing is where they demonstrate their knowledge, whatever it is. And increasingly, we push towards sophisticated essay writing as the goal. So I'll quit ranting, but it makes sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And as I was thinking about that, I always think about process versus product. And I like to push process in the classroom. And so like, even when I teach about research and research writing, we write a big research paper, term paper for the 11th grade world history class that I teach. It's more about the process than the final product. The final product is the paper, but we do a lot of what you're talking about, where it's discussion based and we're sharing and we're analyzing the different sources that they're finding, and we're kind of arguing about like, well, why would this source be good to use versus this one, and how would you use it, and discussing and building up to that point so that they have more of that critical thought that they then could put into their paper. So the Socratic method is really about the process, and it's about gaining that kind of experience and building that thinking muscle so that when they get to creating the product, the paper, the essay, whatever that may be, it could be a presentation, they have that practice, they have that experience to then really make that eloquent and, a great piece of work. So I like this idea of not necessarily grading the actual discussion and using that and explaining that to the students. I think explaining process to the students and the value of process and the value of, again, using that to think about critical thinking as a muscle, that will then help you in that product that you're creating is really valuable for them to understand, because everything that I still see, and I'm in an independent school, is about product, is about what is the grade, what do I need to do to be like, getting that A, on the report card. And I want to kind of continue that conversation of, but what are we really doing here? Right? Like, what are you really doing as a student? Like, what's the point? The point isn't just the A, or it's not just like an excellent paper or presentation, but what led you to that point, and like, how can you then use that in your day-to-day life as a person, not just a student, because you're really a student your whole entire life. Like I tell them, like, not just because I'm a teacher, but in my day-to-day life, like I'm constantly learning and expanding the way I have different perspective and the way I can engage in different conversations and with people who have different opinions than me. Because I think that's a really important aspect of schools right now, is that we need to work on civil discourse. Because
Huge.
as a country, I mean, as a world, but we can look at just America, we are not good at it.
Yeah.
We are not good at it as adults. And I think the Socratic method could also help with that aspect of civil discourse. So I do really appreciate what you're doing and your explanation of that. And getting into your school, so you mentioned how this kind of came out of the pandemic time, and I often talk about that on this show. And so if you want to talk a little bit about the birth of the Socratic Experience School and some of the beginning work you were doing and kind of like where it's going now, that would be great.
Sure. I mean, actually, before getting into that, I want to just touch on something else when you're talking about the students just want the grade. And earlier, before we got on, you were talking about many students are motivated by college admissions. I see many good writing rubrics include, say, voice. And one of the reasons a lot of student writing is flat is it has no voice. There's no personality. I think especially in the age of GPT, voiceless writing is dead. Whereas college admissions committees love to have interesting students. So I often explain to students part of the value. If you're just asking how to get a grade and passively and try to please the teacher, you're already obsolete. That would be the harsh way of talking about it. Whereas they're actually a consulting firm that consults with juniors and seniors on how to become interesting for their college essays. Instead of paying somebody to be how to be interesting, develop your own voice, develop your own individuality, develop who you are, and express that in your writing. And that's actually very powerful for college admissions. So I actually see a way to spin. I perceive your appreciation for this kind of pedagogy, and I actually connect it to the elite college admissions thing, just to kind of give that riff. But yeah, I would say I describe our curriculum at the Socratic Experience as the conscious development of personal identity. Socrates, know thyself, which sounds obscure. Everybody thinks, oh, what's your history curriculum, your language arts curriculum, your math, yada, yada, yada. And, we do have those subjects, but for me, much more fundamental is who are you, what do you stand for, and why? We use the purpose or ikigai diagram. What do you love? What are you good at? What will the world pay for? And what does the world need? And every day, we have a 2-hour block that combines a personal growth session where we talk about how to become a better version of yourself. How do you learn from your mistakes? How do you set goals? How do you deal with anger? What do you do if you're not getting along with your friends? All sorts of fundamental personal growth topics. And then the Socratic dialogues on global texts from around the world. But we get into the, Confucianism and Taoism and Islam and Christianity. And we want kids to think and talk about all sorts of big philosophical worldviews. And then in our STEM program, there's a lot of problem solving. We have the kind of standard linear math curriculum, Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2. But we also have a more open-ended problem solving curriculum where we want them to think, talk, and argue about how to solve problems. Then we have a range of digital media electives. So, obviously the digital world is intense. So our school schedule is Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. core subjects. Then Wednesdays are electives, including things like software development, graphic design, audio engineering, podcasting, video production. And the idea is that we want all of our students to do an entrepreneurial or creative project by the time they graduate based on their personal passions. And some students, write, some produce videos, some do software. Most of them are active online, but we want to take that online energy and make them agents, active agents instead of passive consumers. And they don't have to do a project online, but that's just, a virtual school, a global school. And so a lot of them are involved in projects like that. But the other thing is they can actually do, adult level work. Raheen is exceptional in that she is working on creating a company to employ Pakistani women as web developers. And she is kind of the international business development person who's bringing in real jobs for Pakistani women who otherwise might not have such great lives. And so we actually combine kind of change in the world with this digital work while developing intellectual sophistication. The other piece we have is we have every student is mentored one-on-one for 30 minutes, and the mentor helps them kind of have a personal vision for where they want to go with their life, helps them obviously with academics and so forth. But the big thing is we want them to own their own education, own their own life, and go back to this individuality. If they are an active thinking person with their own purpose in life, then they will be more happy, they will be more successful. And in many cases, even the college admissions committees will appreciate, wow, this is an interesting person. We want to be part of our community.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to student choice and agency. I think, and I talk about this a lot in this show, and it's something that I get quite frustrated with in the traditional school system. And I think there doesn't need to be this amount of courses, this amount of credits, check this box, you need this to get into college, because you're just explaining now your program. And you have students that are going to go and apply to college and universities around the world. So you don't, and there's homeschool students who do the same thing. So it doesn't need to be so rigid. And I just wish that the traditional school system could see that. Like, there's all these alternative methods, and these students are doing very well and getting into college and university. So if that's still the standard of where parents and people want to see their student going off to higher education, you can do it in many different ways. So why can't we infuse that within the traditional school system? Because I see students very apathetic and kind of burnt out because their schedules are overfilled, and they're overfilled with classes and areas that they're not interested in. And, maybe by their junior, senior year, they have a little bit more choice. But then by that time, their mindset is so about, what do I need to do to check boxes to get into this program? They're not thinking about self-exploration and passion. They're only thinking about working the system. Like, we're training them to work the system. And then they go out into the world, and that's like their mindset is like strategy over insight about who they are. And then you wonder why we see a lot of students struggling with mental health and struggling with identity, because we're not fostering that in the school system where they're spending most of their time. And if they have very busy parents, many parents are working a lot, their influence is in the school. And I think we need to be fostering self-exploration. I think meeting with a mentor is wonderful. I'm an advisor in my school, but not all schools have that type of program. And being able to have guidance, but you are there as a student, kind of picking and choosing what you want to dive into. And I like the schedule of, you have these core kind of classes, but in the middle of the week on a Wednesday, it's funny, I've talked about this on the show too, but having a day where it's kind of more open, and you can have like your electives, or maybe you have time to work on these passion projects, or meet with your mentor, or go out there outside the class, whether it's online or if you're in a traditional school building, and go out and you're working in the community and doing maybe some of the work like Raheen's doing, with going and scouting out these women, these web developers, to help them, bring them into the job market. And that could be part of that school week experience, is doing that field work So to me, it makes complete sense. How do we, I know you're like want to promote your schools. You're like, I don't need to infuse this in the traditional school system, but how do you see a place that most of the schools, and I'm just going to focus on America, but there's a lot of, traditional school systems throughout the world, how we can infuse these programs and ideas within the larger school system?
That's a good question. A couple of things. First, I don't know, you've probably heard of the Mastery Transcript. Is your school part of the Mastery Transcript?
No, it's not.
Okay. So that's I want to give credit to the elite private schools who are pushing that because it is focused on mastery rather than seat time. And I think it really is about mastery. And so kind of going back to what we do and some of the issues of time and mental health, we have way less classes. Our kids are much less scheduled than most schools. Our core classes are just 4 hours a day. And so they have a lot more time. There is also a separate, the linear math program I mentioned, but that's self-paced and individualized. When we have math lab, they can drop by half an hour, or whatever, but they can do it at their own pace. And we've got some students who are doing a year of math per year, but other students 2 years, 3 years, 4 years of math a year. If they're motivated in a self-paced tutored math program, they can do a lot of math quickly. If math is not their thing, everything about what we do is personalized, so they can do way less math. And again, part of this is one size fits all. So the student who wants to go to MIT, yes, they need to be doing a ton of math, but they can do it at their own pace. And we also have them do it over the summer, and it's all voluntary. The students, on the other hand, who are not into math, I'm very big on design schools. So a lot of our creatives go to film school, design school, art school, that kind of thing. And so they're not even playing the college game. A lot of our entrepreneurial students are going right into the startup world. And so some of this, it's interesting, even going back to the college admissions piece. And I'm trying to change the mindset, going back to your question of how you change it, is people need to change the mindset. There's a wonderful book called How to Be a High School Superstar by a man named Cal Newport, kind of an expert in learning. And he talks about how to get into Stanford with B's. And you think, oh no, I have B's, my life is over. There's students, I'm sure you have that attitude, and parents have that attitude. He points out, and this is similar to our college admission strategy, doing a really impressive project is actually more important than grades and test scores. I think in that example, he has an example where a student started a nonprofit in Africa and helped thousands of people. And a high school student who does that, it's not so important, your grades. When I went to Harvard, the kid with the lowest SAT scores in my class had been elected mayor of a small town in Michigan. If you can get yourself elected mayor of a town at 18, they don't care so much about your test scores. Different example, I had a friend who was on the Harvard admissions committee, and they saw a student who dropped out of high school, gone to a Buddhist monastery for a year, and came back and got into Harvard. One way to think about that is I've been on scholarship committees for national scholarships. On a Saturday morning, you're reading 500 applications, GPA, test scores, student council, varsity sports, orchestra, volunteer work, yada, yada, yada. And then, oh, the kid who dropped out and went to a Buddhist monastery, that's the one you remember after 500 applications. So this whole thing of being distinctive and individual is actually more important. There are places, University of California system is so huge. It is, they've got hundreds of thousands of applicants. It's grades and test scores, it's just a machine. But for private universities, it's highly personalized, and they want more interesting people. And I'm sure I know lots of professors who complain, just like you said, the professors at universities don't want students who are passive, work in the system. Almost everybody in education does not like that kind of students, and yet we are training students to be that kind of students. Hello.
So true.
So we need kind of courageous leaders at the high school level, at the university level, at the admissions committees level. We're kind of stuck in this unhealthy equilibrium that isn't what anyone really wants. Or, maybe there are a few people who want it, but I think there are a lot of opportunities for people to say, no, we're going to encourage the passion, the interest, the amazing achievement. And the way I think about it is, as long as a student has proven adequate academic ability, that's where we actually do encourage SAT performance for college-bound students, and we have a whole system for that, and AP or college courses. But if they take 3 or 4 AP courses, they don't need 15 or 20. You know, if they get 4s or 5s on 4 AP courses, Harvard knows they're capable. If they do something really amazing that's based on their personal interests, that helps them stand out. So I'm encouraging more people to think this way. The other thing is a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of our families are either entrepreneurs or creative professionals, because people out there who just go out and make things happen, they know jumping through hoops is not the way of the future. And so I think we just need to encourage more people to realize authentic value creation is the win in the 21st century economy in a big way. Jumping through hoops is not. And schools and students and families who are stuck in the jumping through hoops model are ultimately going to be at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the authentic value creation model. That's a big abstract, but that's kind of my high-level preachy version.
Yeah, and thinking as you were talking, because I was reading an article this morning about AI and the recent, I don't know his name off the top of my head, but that kind of was the godfather of the beginning of AI, who just left Google, and quite scary. But the biggest threat right now, because it's moving so quickly, is people losing their jobs. So what AI will be able to do, for a lot of those jobs, which are like just jobs jumping through hoops and just get it done and be a worker bee, AI is going to take that over eventually. And so I think it's important that we foster that you are a unique, independent individual, and what are your unique talents, and how do you stand out and provide something very different to the world, and not just necessarily checking the boxes to get this degree to fall into this job that might be taken from you from AI or whatever else in the future. So the entrepreneurial route, I think, is really important. And with that, you need space and time. So I think what the traditional school system needs to eventually try to do, and maybe it happens little by little, is scaling back the school day from having like 8 subjects, 8 periods in a day of all these courses you have to take, and making some of this space for students to meet with a mentor, to work on an entrepreneurial project or an activism project, whatever that may be, and have some field time, have some time, in the high school level. And that's, where I've been most of my career. They don't need to be supervised all day long. So I feel like the old school system was like, well, my kid needs to be somewhere. It needs to be supervised, like it's childcare. And by the time, honestly, by the time they're like 14 years old, they don't need to be. If we give them some freedom and we give them, some structure with that freedom, they're going to do okay. And they're probably going to do better than feeling like they're just being watched and supervised and dictated all day long. That's when they kind of want to be a little bit more rebellious and maybe do things that aren't so great, because there's so much in a box. And these kids today, this generation, they know it and they see it, and they're starting to fight against it. Just like we see, like rebelling against the systems in different ways. Like students are starting to really kind of like buck the system a little bit, because they know that this isn't working and this is not the way of the future. And I don't want to be in this anymore. And so you do see a lot of parents, families pulling students out of the traditional method and going to some of these other schools, like your school, or homeschooling. And you see a lot of teachers also leaving the profession. So there has to be a change. Like it has to happen. And I think it has to happen within the next like few years, not like, a decade or 2 down the road. And it doesn't have to be a whole upheaval of the whole system. But you do need to start to see like these like schedule changes and mind shift changes of like, how are we actually doing school? So I think even just promoting what you're doing at the Socratic Experience, having this conversation. One of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast was to share these ideas and really to inspire people within the education system to do things a little differently.
But big time. And I didn't get to the mental health thing. Everything you say is true, and I would multiply it 10 times. But just, and the irrelevance of school for most kids. At a private Quaker school, if you're seeing kids who are less motivated, at the nation as a whole, United States as a whole, Yale did a study a couple of years ago, 75% of high school students are unhappy at school. 75%.
Mhm.
Gallup for decades has been charting what they call the engagement cliff. In elementary school, about 60% of students are engaged. By high school, only about 1 in 3 students is engaged in learning. The vast majority of students are tuned out and unhappy.
Yeah.
Another statistic, and this is horrifying, suicide in high school is related to the academic year, and teenagers commit suicide at about double the rate on Mondays during certain school months as compared to July. We know that this pattern is associated with school because once they leave school, that seasonal pattern vanishes. Something very simple, and of course, I give a lot of credit to Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt for calling attention to the adolescent mental health crisis. And yes, I completely agree with them that social media has exacerbated it. But I think what nobody's paying attention are the underlying school issues, some of which I've mentioned, but one other piece, simply if a student feels cared about at school, they are half as likely to attempt suicide. And this is not rocket science for students to feel cared about. The surveys on school connectedness are, does somebody at school care about you? And I'm sure in a Quaker school, they all feel cared about. But these mental health issues are becoming urgent. The 21st century economy, I agree with everything you say there. People who can't think for themselves are going to become obsolete very rapidly. And we do urgently need to shift the system. I would encourage people to form coalitions. I don't think the system as a system is going to change, but there are educators who get this, there are parents who get this, there are entrepreneurs, there are people in the community who get this. So I see people creating coalitions around a different model of education. And one by one, can we push this institution in this direction, or do we start new institutions? Then just one other piece. Insofar as our biggest goal is for students to own their own education and own their own life, it makes teaching so much more joyful. I get people, every day I have people inbound asking me if they can teach here when we never advertise for teachers, because I think most teachers know that the old system is not working.
Yeah.
And so I think this is really going to be a big win for teachers and students. And we just have to get out of this old model willy-nilly, in 1,000 different ways. Again, the system's not going to change, but 1,000 different ways we need to push in this direction.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, that a whole system just doesn't change, and it's not going to change with policymakers and with the government, but it's about individual people, little by little, gathering in community and saying, this doesn't work anymore, and we're going to do something different. And then that challenges the system. And over time, you could see these newer types of, schools, and the education system will eventually change. And I see that happening. So I applaud what you're doing at the Socratic Experience. Just being able to talk with Raheen as one of the students there, and that you mentor. She is phenomenal. I mean, she is light years ahead of so many young adults. And the fact that she kind of just took education into her own hands and came to your school and is flourishing. It's just that right there is an example of, what you're doing. And so I applaud you and thank you for coming on and sharing more about your work.
I'm delighted to be here, Jackie. And yeah, if there's anything I can do to support you or people in your audience, I'm happy to do so. Again, my book, The Habit of Thought, it was designed to help teachers in classrooms. So that's concretely. Actually, I also have a YouTube channel called Socratic Michael Strong, where the daughter of a friend, I began working with her when she was 4 years old, and she is now 10. So if people want to see the longitudinal development of a 4-year-old becoming at 10, she is taking a college Python course and mostly learning it on her own. We've got a tutor helping her some, and she's working with another student. But yeah, well, the other thing is this is a long-term play. You can measure content coverage. It's easier to quantify. I think the whole content coverage piece comes from it's easier for school administrators and systems to measure. But I see this long-term intellectual development as more important and harder to measure. And we need people who believe in this to do the long game with us.
Absolutely. I will share all of your information in the show notes. So anyone who's interested to learn more about Michael Strong, the Socratic Experience, look at your book or YouTube channel, that will be links in the show notes. So thank you, Michael, for coming on the show. And this has just been a great joy to have this conversation. Very, very, I'm very aligned with what you're doing and what you're talking about today.
Thank you, Jackie. Great to talk with you.
Okay. Have a great day.
Okay, bye.